On today's episode of Faith in Focus, I want to talk about the end of the world. Um, I've been reading and been following the writings and been listening to podcasts from a guy named Robert Schoch and other people, and they talk about how kind of redating civilization and when civilization emerged and kind of these ancient civilizations. But there's an element of it that involves the sun and the end of the ice age and the global flood, and that I think is very intriguing, and I wonder, and I want to kind of ruminate on this idea that maybe that gives us a hint of something that's going to happen at the end of the world when Christ comes back. So I want to talk about all of that and kind of whet your appetite to looking into this stuff a little bit more and piquing your interest on this very intriguing topic. So that's what we're going to talk about on this episode. Hey guys, if you've been a listener of Faith in Focus for a while and have enjoyed what you've been hearing, I would love it if you would consider becoming a monthly supporter of the ministry. As a missionary within faith, my work is entirely supported by listeners like you, who believe in the work God has called me to do, and podcasting is just a small part of that. I also teach the Bible at my local church, in the ministry house I live in, and with the young men God has put in my life to disciple. I also do biblical counseling that is entirely donation-based, so your monthly support goes in part to help support counseling sessions for people who may not be able to afford any or all of the cost of counseling. And with your monthly support, I would be able to go on to full-time ministry, which would include more podcast recording, new podcast ideas that we've had, and different forms of online teaching, as well as more availability for counseling sessions. If you'd like to become a monthly supporter, you can email me at dennissotheby@infaith.org or head over to infaith.com/Dennis-Sotheby. Thank you. Well, one of the most interesting things about the Bible is it kind of gives us a grand picture of all of human history. It starts with creation, obviously, and goes all the way to the new heavens, new earth, recreation, however you want to frame that or call that. But, at the end, we have this picture of Jesus returning. He's coming back to, set up his kingdom, set the world right, all this kind of stuff. But the Bible pictures that what's called the day of the Lord, this returning of this King Messiah to set up his kingdom as a kind of a pretty chaotic, very tumultuous time. I talked about in an earlier episode that the 70th week of Daniel, that tribulation period. So I won't rehash all that stuff again, but that's this period leading up to the return of Christ where, the prophets talk about the earth being, just hammered so much by, plagues and earthquakes and judgment that the earth kind of reels like a drunken person staggering through the streets because, they're so intoxicated. That's the earth is just completely racked with, pain and suffering. And so this terrible time of tribulation leading up to the return of Christ. And so I like to think about that stuff and try to kind of understand, what's going to happen and kind of keep an eye on, what the Bible says is going to happen and try to understand that a little bit. And in thinking about all this stuff, I had come across the teachings, the writings of a guy named Robert Schoch, and I heard about him first on an episode of Joe Rogan a few years back, and I'll link to that Rogan episode. It's really intriguing, and as far as Rogan shows go, it's fairly clean. Usually, he's got quite a bit of language and stuff, but it's fairly tame and fairly clean. So I'll link to it in the show notes. But so Robert Schoch is a geologist. He's a professor and at Boston University, I think. And he had, for the past 30 years, he didn't initially get into this kind of stuff, but he was a geologist, and about 30 years ago, he was invited to Egypt to look at the weathering patterns on the Sphinx, and he talks about this in the episode. And he writes about it in a couple of books. I'll also link to his books. He has one called The Origins of the Sphinx. He has one called Forgotten Civilization. But he goes to Egypt, and he, as a geologist, looks at the weathering on the Sphinx. And he talks about how, the Sphinx, if you've never been there, which I haven't, but, you watch his videos and stuff, you can get pictures of this. It's actually kind of down under the ground. It's called, the enclosure that it was dug into. So it's got these walls sort of up around it. And he says, within 2 minutes, he was able to look at the weathering pattern on the Sphinx and specifically the enclosure and realize that it was weathered not by sand and wind, but by rain, and torrential rainfalls have weathered this thing. So, and again, he didn't really know anything about, ancient civilizations, the dating of the Sphinx and the pyramids and all that stuff in Egypt, but he was able to just look at this and said, this was rainfall, heavy rainfall, torrential rainfall, and water runoff that weathered this enclosure. This wasn't sand and rain. So then that kind of, raised the problem of, where did this rain come from? Egypt is in this desert Saharan climate. There's not rainfall, but, a long time ago, several thousand years ago, it was more of a tropical climate. There was, even in biblical times, you talk about lions, roaming in the Middle East and Israel and that stuff, and they don't exist there now because it's not that kind of climate anymore. But they did at one point, and so then that kind of like really throws the whole understanding of our history for a loop. When civilization arose, and so the traditional understanding is that humans were primitive, ignorant people, hunter gatherers, kind of cavemen dwelling people, and then it was about 4,000, 3,000, 4,000 BC that they started to kind of rise out of that, and civilization started to arise, and then that's at the point where they started to build these grand structures like the Sphinx, the pyramids, Easter Island he talks about in Forgotten Civilizations, these different places that have these grand structures. It's like, where did these come from? Because they seem to be way older than history says that they are. And so that's kind of been his, what he's been mostly known for is really investigating this idea of the civilization had this, there was an ancient civilization. And when people hear that, they think like advanced people, like, that would have iPhones and computers and stuff, thousands and thousands of years ago. He doesn't, that there's no evidence of that. And that doesn't necessarily, isn't necessarily a marker of advanced civilization, but that there was this advanced civilization that existed, 10,000 BC and further back, that did build and construct these massive pyramids, the Sphinx, these massive things that have lasted through the ages. Obviously, pottery and stuff like that wouldn't necessarily last. That's too long. But, large stone structures would last. And so that really shows, like, how did these people build these things if civilization didn't arise until, 4,000 BC? What were these people, how were these people building these things, 7,000 years before that? This is at the time of, the Ice Age. And so he contends, and others do as well, Graham Hancock, who has been on Rogan, Randall Carlson, John Anthony West, and they mention all these people in this episode I'll link to. They all, and it's a growing belief that there was this advanced civilization, that humanity did have advanced knowledge of, secrets of the universe, how to, certain kind of, maybe physics and mechanics of how to build these structures, and these things align with astronomical markers in the sky. Certain stars and constellations, and they seem to have an awareness of the precession of the Earth, that the Earth kind of wobbles, and the North Star, changes every 26,000 years. They seem to have this knowledge that, where do they get this from? And so it's a really interesting topic. And the thing about Robert Schoch being a geologist, he's able to look at kind of the science and the data of this. And what I found interesting in listening to him is, for those of us who obviously read the Bible and believe, the story of Noah's Ark, that there was this global flood that existed, people often think like, oh, that's just, a myth. Come on, how could that have ever happened? And even there's always kind of this apologetic defense of a global flood, because you go all over the world to tribal people in Papua New Guinea, people in South America, all over the place. These people, primitive people, all have this story, this myth in their past of a global flood wiping out, the world, and the gods were angry, all this kind of stuff. So it's sort of like this has to be a story that actually happened, that is a kind of a universal myth of the human race, a history of the human race, rather, that has become mythologized throughout cultures. And what I found interesting is Robert Schoch and others don't deny, they believe that there was this global flood. And if you watch Robert Schoch's videos and his lectures he appears on different shows and stuff, they're able to pinpoint down to 9,700 BC, so almost 10,000 BC, about 12,000 years ago, that the Ice Age. And when people think of the Ice Age, they think, oh, the Earth was completely uninhabited. It was like Pluto or something. It was completely frozen, and no one could live on it. But that wasn't the case. It was drastically different. But the way I always describe it to people is, it was just that the Arctic shelf, was further down. So like Michigan would be like what northern Canada is like, and Florida would be much more like Michigan. It just, everything's kind of colder further down, but it was habitable. People moved around, and that's how people theorized that maybe how did they get across oceans or whatever, that they crossed ice shelves, or maybe the water level was different, so land looked different at that time. So it was a completely different planet as far as it looked like at that time. But this Ice Age came to a very sudden end, like that, like just very rapidly, about 9,700 BC. And so Robert Schoch explains the science behind this, and that it happened suddenly within like days or weeks. So they can look at, stratification in the ice cores in Greenland, and it's kind of like a tree, the rings on a tree. You can count them and see how many years old the tree is. Well, you can do that with ice cores, because, just think about, here in Michigan, for instance, or if you live someplace where there's ice, part of the danger of when, you have a bad snowfall and the snow gets packed down and then it melts a little bit and then it freezes again, is it's kind of laying down that, like, it melted and then froze again. You can kind of mark seasons that way, where the snow and the ice will melt but then refreeze, and then a new snowfall will fall, and so it can kind of layer down like this, and they can count the strata and kind of count how many years back something happened, or how many years it took for something to happen. And they can see that at 9,700 BC something radical happened, and it ended the ice. It basically just ejected us the planet out of an ice age like that, which then created this global flood. Because you got to imagine, like, if all of this ice melted rapidly, or then the ice shelves broke away, creating tsunamis and rising ocean, it's just going to flood everywhere. So Robert Schoch talks about this and explains kind of the science behind what would have happened and what would have caused this. And it's his theory that what happened at that point was a solar outburst. He calls it a coronal mass ejection. And we can see pictures of this happening. The sun, people will take images of the sun, and you could see these bursts of, just plasma bursting off the side of the sun. Almost looks like giant shotgun blast of solar radiation blasting off the sun. Well, that's fine if it's pointed in the other direction, but if the Earth is in line of that and it's a massive enough one that that's going to hit the Earth. And so he talks about how that that could have happened. So there's all this evidence at that time of things that had happened, earthquakes, massive volcanic eruptions, glass, like of massive heat hitting water and flash flooding, and hitting sand and earth and creating like just this volcanic kind of glass all over the place. And there seems to be all over the world that this has happened. And so it's his belief, and some people believe it was a comet striking the earth, and he gives his reasons why he thinks it was a solar flare, just this massive 1 in 100,000 year event where the sun shot out this massive burst. And another evidence that he uses to say this seems like it was a solar thing was all over the earth, in caves in all of these different countries. There people would etch and carve into cave walls the same image, and it kind of looks like a stick figure with his legs spread and arms up in the air, and it looks like a human. It got a head, whatever. And all of these images seem to appear, all dozens and dozens and dozens of examples all over the earth in these caves. And it's the same thing. And what the theory is it's this kind of like the northern lights, when these solar flare would hit the earth, it would manifest itself in the sky with these symbols, not symbols, like aurora borealis, and these waves going through the sky. And because one of these hasn't hit the earth, since we've developed photography, we don't know exactly what it would look like, but somebody in a lab has duplicated this on a smaller scale, and it does create like these waving images that, if you were to look up into the sky, like we would look up at clouds and say, well, that one kind of looks like a giraffe. The waves of the solar burst, crashing over the earth, and the magnetic poles, just like what the northern lights do, kind of look like these shapes, these giant stick figures in the sky with their arms raised and stuff. And so there's all of this reason why he believes scientifically that this was a solar burst that rapidly warmed the earth within days or weeks, created he describes it as like a hurricane times a million. It would create like these thunderstorms. The pressure from it hitting the earth would cause earthquakes all over the earth, volcanic eruptions, which would cause this chaos. And all of this, it would cause the sea levels to rise to just completely wipe out humanity. And it's just so interesting. And you really got to listen to the episode. If you just go on any podcast and you just search Robert Schoch, you'll probably find the Joe Rogan one first. But like I said, I'll link to it. But he appears on a lot of other shows as well, talking about this theory. And it's very convincing. It's very compelling. And so then I got thinking about that. And when you lay that theory of human history, of rather than being like primitive, ignorant people who knew nothing until about 6,000 years ago, and then rising up into civilization and building these grand structures, if you view it much more like, if you view it much more that there was an advanced civilization who knew much more about space, planetary alignments, constellations, the secrets of the universe, and how to build these grand structures that have survived, and then all of a sudden you see humanity arising again about 6,000 years ago, that really, if you kind of overlay that with biblical history, that really does sort of fit, doesn't it? What you see in the first 12 chapters of Genesis. You see Adam and Eve being created by God himself, and Adam walking with God in the garden. And then after the fall, even Adam lives for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years and propagates, the human race, millions and millions of people being born, but and Adam still being alive and being around. And you kind of have to imagine those people, the early history, at least according to the Bible, would not have been ignorant people. I mean, here you have Adam who is walking with God. I mean, how many secrets of the universe did God communicate to Adam? Did he communicate to Adam how to do and build these certain, these structures? The wisdom and the knowledge of how to do it, how the stars work, and how, the universe and space and all this stuff. And maybe even, we talk about, how did humans live to be hundreds of years old? And people say, well, the climate was probably different before the flood. And I'm not going to deny that maybe that plays a part of it. But I also wonder, like, maybe Adam knew a way. He had secrets of how to live, how to eat, what to eat, and, medicinal things that did allow human life to flourish and extend. We just don't know. But you kind of overlay that with human history, and you just think, man, imagine how advanced civilization must have been. Think about, just pick like an Albert Einstein. What if he lived to be 900 years old and could keep learning and keep passing on his knowledge? I mean, it would be incredible. So you just have to imagine humanity being able to tap into the wisdom and knowledge that somebody like Adam must have had and these early humans must have had. So you have that element. Okay, there must have been this advanced civilization that knew a lot more than we give them credit for. Well, then what happens? A flood wipes them out completely, and wipes them down to nothing. And as Schoch talks about, he calls it solar-induced dark age. It basically just eliminates humans down to nothing. And so all of that knowledge is just gone. That wisdom is gone. It's, it's just contained in basically Noah and his family. So you can imagine, like, if every intelligent person just gets wiped off the planet, and then, like, okay, I think I've read something about Albert Einstein, E equals MC square means something, and relativity. Like, you now just basically have me and maybe like 8 other people who kind of remember this stuff. And so there would be remnants of that knowledge, but it would be by and large mostly lost. And then, so what do you see after the flood? The first thing humans do is they start to come back together and build the Tower of Babel, which most biblical scholars and historians believe was some form of they call it a ziggurat, almost like a not like a tower like we would think of a skyscraper, but like a pyramid type structure. A religious.
Here's what I found.
Sorry, my Apple Watch started talking to me. It was almost like a religious temple, like pyramid type thing, where they would go to the top, they would reach into the heavens, and worship the stars and all that kind of stuff. Things that they were doing before. They were kind of probably hobbling together as a humanity this ancient wisdom and knowledge that they had before the flood, and God comes down and says, no, we can't allow humanity to go down this route again. Let's slow this down. And that's when he confounds the language. Everyone spreads out, goes to the different parts of the world, and that's where our different nations kind of come from. And then that enters into this dark age, this lull in human civilization, until you get to Abraham and the Semitic people, that the people that are just very kind of tent living, dwelling, and then civilization arises again. And so that seems to fit very accurately with what you would expect given the biblical history. Now, as far as the end of the world, okay, so we've talked a lot about Genesis and stuff, but what does this have to do with the end of the world? What I find interesting is that Jesus himself says, if this theory is correct, which, we're Bible believers, we believe that there was a global flood. We're Bible believers, so we believe that, man, it's not unreasonable that there would be this ancient civilization that would have been wiped out by this flood that had all this knowledge and stuff. And, man, it had to have happened somehow, and the solar outburst seems to be a very valid theory. Well, when Jesus is talking in Matthew 24, he very famously says, no one knows the day and hour when this is going to happen, when the Son of Man is going to come back. But in Matthew 24:37, he says, as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. Just before the flood, people were eating and drinking and giving in marriage. And we often think like that what Jesus is referring to is like, well, just like in the days of Noah, people were eating and drinking and giving in marriage. That's what it's going to be like before the end of the world. And to me, that's kind of like, well, people always eat and drink and give in marriage. That doesn't seem to be something that was unique with the time of Noah. And even the idea of like sudden judgment coming upon people, that he could have used Sodom and Gomorrah, he could have used, any numerous example, but he uses Noah for some reason. And my thinking is like, well, what if he's trying to let us know that a similar thing that happened at the time of Noah is going to happen again? Now, God obviously is not going to flood the earth again like he did, but there's going to be something similar that happens, that goes on. And what I find amazing is that in the book of Revelation, we see immediately before the second coming of Christ, we see these angels pouring out these bowls of God's wrath upon the earth. And in Revelation chapter 16, verse 8, it says, "The fourth angel poured out his bowl upon the sun, and it was given to it to scorch men with fire. Men were scorched with fierce heat, and they blasphemed the name of God, who had the power of these plagues, and they did not repent so as to give God glory. Then the fifth angel poured out his bowl on the throne of the beast, and his kingdom became darkened. And they gnawed their tongues because of pain, and they blasphemed the God of heaven, and they did not repent of their deeds." So that's two things that, the fourth and fifth bowl pouring out the sun that scorches men and causes this darkness and this pain, people crying out in pain. And, this idea of darkness, Schoch goes on to talk about how, if this happens again, which is not outside of the realm of possibility, especially as the sun goes through waves and becomes more and more active at certain points, it's not unreasonable to think that this could happen again. And we do have an example of a minor, of when this happened on a minor scale. Back in the 1850s, there was something called the Carrington event. I think it was like 1852 or something like that. A relatively minor solar outburst hit the Earth, and people could see it. And at that time, the only form of electronics that we had, you have to imagine this would be basically like an EMT, something that would just electromagnetic, or EMP, that would just electromagnetic pulse, just wipe out electronics. The only electronics that existed at that time were telegraph machines. And so when this thing hit, it fried those machines, and it caused certain telegraph stations to burst into flames. It just short-circuited all of these electronics. And you got to think of now, like, what would happen if that happened again on a massive scale like it did, in 9,700 BC, that precipitated the Great Flood and the wiping out of humanity. Even if it wasn't even on that massive of a scale, it would wipe out all electronics on the Earth. Everything would fry, and lights would go out, and satellites would start falling from the sky. And, you have to kind of wonder, like, is that what John is picturing when he's seeing, these giant, the stars, these things falling from the sky? Imagine what a satellite to an ancient person, even to a moderner, what that would look like. Satellites crashing back to the Earth would look like comets, falling to the Earth, hitting the ground, and they would lose all of their electronics. Those would get wiped out. The lights, everything would be gone. We would be knocked down to nothing. We would be in complete darkness, like it says. And it's causing pain, pain, people crying out in pain. And I almost wonder if maybe that's not like tied to, we know at this point there's going to be this mark of the beast. Now, we don't need to speculate necessarily on what the mark of the beast is, the number, whether it's stamped on your forehead or whatever, but we do know that you're going to have it in order to transact and do business, buy and sell stuff. So most people are convinced it's got to be some kind of, digital electronic currency. And what if people are getting things implanted into their body? I mean, you think about somebody who would have like a pacemaker, even if an EMP hit and just fried that thing. If it didn't kill you, it would just cause incredible pain. Just imagine a little microchip, like, in your forehead or in your hand that just, fried out and just, shocked. We knew a guy that he had wasn't a pacemaker. I'm not sure what it was called, but it was basically almost like one of those things that shock your heart to get it back into rhythm. He had it like an automatic one that was put inside and it monitored his heart. And if he was having a heart attack, it would shock him. Well, sometimes it would malfunction and it would just go off. And it happened one time at a work dinner, and he just literally fell out of his chair, passed out. It just shocked him and knocked him down. And you just imagine like just a little microchip in your hand, or in your forehead, just fried out your brain, whatever, and just all of this kind of stuff. You're holding your phone, all of a sudden it bursts into flames. Like, that would be insane. And people would be, they would be scorched by the sun. There would be darkness. People would be crying out in pain. And again, it's the same thing that happened at the time of Noah. The solar burst that wiped out humanity. Well, is it going to happen again? And then the other thing too, the thing that always crops up at the second coming of Christ. These things are happening, and Schoch talks about what would have happened at the end of the last ice age when this happened would be just the pressure, the climactic change of this outburst hitting the sun. You got to almost imagine, like, if you have you maybe you've seen those big giant like air gun sort of things. You pull back this big plastic thing and you blow it at somebody, and you just shoots this air at somebody. You can blow stuff off tables from really far away. They're kind of fun to play with, but you imagine something like that from the sun hitting the earth. Just the pressure alone would cause like volcanoes to start erupting. It would cause, if earthquakes were about to happen, it would set them off, and these earthquakes would be happening all over the earth. Things would be falling from the sky, satellites falling from the sky. There would be massive storms all over the earth. The sun would be darkened because of all this stuff. It just, all of these things that are describing the second coming of Christ. There's always like this idea of this global earthquake. Continuing on in Revelation 16, it says, when the seventh angel poured out, it says it's done. There were flashes of lightning, sounds, and peals of thunder. There was a great earthquake, such as there had not been since man came upon the earth. So great an earthquake was it, and so mighty. The great city was split into 3 parts. Babylon the Great was remembered for God to give a cup of wine of his fierce wrath. Every island fled away, and the mountains were not found. So you just imagine mountains crumbling. Maybe seas rising enough to cover up, Hawaii. Maybe Hawaii is just gone. Like a tsunami comes in and wipes out Hawaii. Huge hailstones, 100 pounds each, came down from heaven upon men. They blasphemed God. And then, similar imagery in Revelation 6. The moon turned into blood. The stars of the sky fell to the earth. Again, not literal stars, but it would kind of look like to ancient people, like stars falling out of the sky. The sky receded. Every mountain and island was moved from its place. And what's interesting is it says, the kings of the earth and the nobles and commanders, the rich, mighty, and every slave, free man, hid in the caves among the rocks and the mountains. And they said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of the one seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. And that's amazing because, Schoch talks about, the only people that would have survived and 9700 BC when this happened would have been people who made it into caves. You'd have to hide in caves from, the scorching sun, from these lightning storms, from the hailstorms. Like everyone else would be killed. And you just have to imagine what would happen if this happened again. People would be, fleeing into the mountains trying to, hide, and, your house wouldn't be safe. If there's global earthquakes and lightning storms and stuff like that hitting the earth, or, hitting stuff, it would just be burning stuff. The only thing that would be safe is being under rocks. And even that, you would just be like, fall on us and collapse on us. So to me, it's quite incredible that, there's this theory that, is this what brought about the end of an advanced civilization in the past and precipitated the global flood, which we see in the Bible? What would have probably been an advanced civilization, wiped out by a flood, maybe wiped out by this event that seems, if it was to happen again, would cause all of the same reactions as it did back then. But the Bible's saying all of these same reactions are going to happen right before the second coming of Christ. The sun scorching people, darkness, pain on the earth, earthquakes around the world, things falling from the sky, people hiding in caves, saying, protect us or whatever. To me, it's compelling. It's interesting, and it's worth thinking about. Again, it's just theories. It's just speculation. But I do find it quite interesting, as it was in the days of Noah, maybe with this solar flare ending the ice age and wiping out humanity, maybe it's going to be that way again. Maybe God's going to repeat history and we're going to get blasted with another solar flare that's going to wipe out humanity preceding the second coming of Christ. It's worth thinking about. It's interesting, quite frightening, but for humanity. But for we as Christians, of course, we are eagerly anticipating the second coming of Christ. And I think most all Christians believe, whether you believe it happened at the beginning of the tribulation or it happens, at the end here. I think most Christians are saying, we look up, our salvation draws nigh, Christ is coming. He rescues us from the wrath of the Lamb, takes us out. I think at this point we're probably safe. I think he's going to remove us from the earth because he's about to blast it with the sun or with whatever he's going to do. So I hope this encourages you to look into this topic more. Like I said, I'll link to the podcast episode with Robert Schoch when he was on Rogan. I'll link to a couple of his books. And hopefully you'll check it out, and this will pique your interest, and you'll study it and research it a little bit more. So have a good one. While Faith in Focus is a ministry of In Faith, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of In Faith as a mission.